Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our Intermarium ongoing show of a place that doesn't exist except in our imagination. We'd like it to exist and to prosper and be happy and be fruitful and multiply. Today we have our own Vilen Khlgatyan, who has developed a serpentine string of titles. He's a vice chairman of Political Developments Research Center, which is a virtual think tank based in Yerevan. If it's virtual, how do we know it's based in Yerevan?
That's where the server is.
It's a secret. At any rate, he attended Webster University, where he double majored in international relations and international business, graduating in spring 2010. Then Vilen traveled to Vienna, where he spent a semester studying there in Austria. He took advantage of the international surroundings and attended OPEC and OSCE workshops. In 2013, in the spring, he graduated from the Institute of World Politics after much pain, but he's still around because he likes to share the pain and inflicted upon me, which I thoroughly enjoy, because every single time we embark on a project, I learn, and I hope this will be a good learning experience to you. Today's topic is Armenia and Ukraine. Vilen he'll tell you all about it, but he's noticed that there are parallels. Indeed, there are, because the countries of the Intermarium are stuck between, like Jordan, a rock and a hard place. Or as they say, Iraq in a hard place. But in this case, it's in the post-Soviet zone, it's Russia and the EU. So let's hear it from Vilen. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So I want to thank everyone for coming. It's a nice turnout. Thank you for taking the time to come out. Hopefully you all take away something. As Professor and Dr. Odakevich pointed out, there are definitely parallels between the Ukraine and Armenia as far as the orientation, the pressure put on both states by Brussels and Moscow to essentially stop sitting on the fence. Both countries have, more so Ukraine than Armenia, have pursued a policy of at times brinksmanship, although that's not the most appropriate term, but in a sense it has been. And what I mean by that is essentially playing both sides and trying to get as much out of Moscow and Brussels as possible. This is more evident with Ukraine, and that's why most of the presentation will actually focus on Ukraine more so than Armenia, especially since Armenia already made its decision to go with the customs union, which is Moscow's initiative, and Ukraine is it's 50-50 right now. If you had asked most people a month ago, they would have told you Ukraine's going with the EU, but now some developments that I'll talk about here shortly, that's not so certain anymore, so let's dive right in. Some of you are already much more familiar with the topic than others, but just to bring everyone up to speed, some background information. I'll start with the EU first. So the European Union Association Agreement, it's a broad framework, as the slide says, and it's between the EU member states, the 28 countries, and whichever country that they're negotiating with. So in this case, for example, the Ukraine and Armenia earlier. Before, when the association agreement was conducted with different countries, it didn't necessarily include a free trade agreement, but post-2000 and later on in the decade, virtually all association agreements also come with a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. And that's the carrot aspect of it. Essentially, the EU wants you to meet their norms, so-called European norms, both on the human rights issues, political issues, and obviously the economic and financial system have to be in line with what Brussels wants, so that the two systems can be coherent, can work together. This is just, I pulled this from the actual wording of the treaty that covers free trade agreements. I highlighted number 6 because, as I'm going to talk about it more so during the course of the presentation, for the most part, the association agreement, especially from Brussels' perspective, they have little to gain essentially economically, especially when we're talking about the Eastern Partnership countries, which are Ukraine, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Moldova. In the sense that these countries economically, their GDP is very tiny compared to the EU, which has a nearly $17 trillion GDP, so it's a huge discrepancy there. And the element that is most important for the EU from their perspective is to bring these countries into their norms, as I said, and that's why it's the association agreement, the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. They're political initiatives more so than economic initiatives. So the name, if you just look at it at first, association agreement, free trade, the first thing I usually think of is the economic and the trade aspect. And yes, that is there. It's that's definitely a part of it. But for the EU specifically, the bigger issue, and with the Eastern European countries, the Eastern Partnership countries, it's bringing the values and the system that Brussels holds dear to these countries. Ukraine has been in talks with Brussels essentially since '94, since the second Ukrainian president, Leonid Kuchma, he actually started the talks. So it's not new. The negotiations have been ongoing. It's basically almost 20 years now. And they did sign a partnership and cooperation agreement in the early mid-90s. And that's still in place, but obviously the association agreement is much more comprehensive. Its aim is more broad, and it will be replacing the PCA if it's signed. It's already been initialed, and the initialing just essentially means that the wording, both sides agreed on the wording, and it was ready, and the signing is being held up for political issues, and I'll get to that as well. Selective justice, as the EU keeps referring to their problem, their ongoing problem with Kiev. And a little bit more background on the Eastern Partnership. It was created in May 2008. And 2008 is, for several reasons, I think will go down as a very pivotal year, not just in Europe, but other parts of the world. Beijing Olympics, it was the so-called coming out party of China. There was the Russo-Georgian War, which definitely reconfigured the geopolitical calculus in the Caucasus in favor of Russia. And the Eastern Partnership program really got a boost right after that war. Poland and Sweden, unsurprisingly, are the two backers of this initiative. It was the brainchild of the Poles and the Swedes to a lesser extent. Geopolitically, this makes sense because, especially in the case of Poland, having a rough history, to put it mildly, in regards to both their western neighbors as well as their eastern neighbors, their policy essentially since independence has been to integrate with Euro-Atlantic community and to more or less keep the Russians at bay whenever possible. And Sweden has shared these goals along with the Baltic countries. So the Russian-Georgian War of August really gave an impetus to speed up the process, because Europe realized that time was not on their side, that just as China was having a so-called coming out party, Russia was not the Russia of the 1990s. It had recuperated a good deal of the strength that it had lost with the collapse of the Soviet Union. It had a grand strategy that it was pursuing, and many of the EU countries, especially those bordering Russia, the so-called New Europe, the former communist countries, felt threatened, different reasons, but Poland being the largest and the most powerful of so-called New Europe, obviously jumped on the chance to speed up things. And the bigger issue at stake is also the future, and this is a slightly different topic, but I want to touch upon it, is the future of what the EU means for the individual countries and what their foreign policy is. As some of you may know, the European Union doesn't have a true common foreign policy. They don't have a military policy as well. They're working on it, but they've been working on it for the past 15 years. And there's definitely a divide, which I'll touch upon later, specific to even the Ukraine issue, between some old European countries along with the new European countries and some mostly old European countries. And by that I mean, Germany and the Benelux countries, for example, are more hesitant towards signing an AA with some of these Eastern European and Caucasian countries than, for example, Poland or the Scandinavian states. And that, I think, is, again, due to geography as well as history. Touching upon the customs union, because that's the other option presented to the Ukrainians and earlier to the Armenians. The customs union is a very new project in comparison to the European Union, which has essentially more or less in one form or another has been around since the 50s. It was created beginning of January. Currently it includes Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. Just as the name would imply, it's a free trade zone. They've brought all their laws and regulations into compliance, with the exception of some anti-dumping issues that still have to be solved, and also some strategic industries. More or less everything is duty-free, and the idea is to obviously expand it to other post-Soviet and Eurasian countries. And of course, I mentioned the GDP of the EU. It's 17 trillion given on the year. The GDP nominal of the customs union CU is much less. As you can see, it's 2.3 trillion, and the vast majority of that, over 90% almost, is the Russian Federation. So Russia is the dominant player, with no questions in the customs union, whereas the EU has a couple, but with the troubles that they're facing, Germany's, I guess, the Russian equivalent in the EU. And the precursor to the Eurasian Union, which is, you often hear that's the brainchild of Vladimir Putin. In a sense, that's true, but it's something that I'll be getting on later. It's part of a strain in Russian thought called Eurasianism that has been around for 100 years now. And in fact, its modern advocates include some well-known Russian political philosophers like Alexander Dugin. Some of you may have heard of him, and even Kazakhstan's President Nursultan Nazarbayev mentioned it in a speech at some college in Russia in '94. So while Putin obviously has taken the initiative, as I mentioned, this strain of a Eurasian economic union, political union, it's nothing new. This is just, you could say, Eurasianism 2.0. So as you can see on the slide, it's a more deep form of the customs union. It'll be more political than the customs union. There's talk of even setting up a common currency. So it wouldn't necessarily be the ruble, although that's one option. They've talked about, I was reading an article not too long ago that they've even talked about something similar to Bitcoin, a digital currency, so paperless currency as a possibility as well. Touching on Eurasianism a bit, there's a few strains of it. The two dominant ones and the two ones that I've studied the most, the current one, which I mentioned, was Alexander Dugin, and the older one had its movement among the White Russians, the defeated party in the Russian Civil War. Many of them obviously had to flee the Soviet Union, and those that ended up in Western Europe and other parts of the West, they were obviously against Bolshevism and the communists. So a branch of the White Russians, who also you could say were Pan-Slavs, were adherents of Pan-Slavism, and somewhat anti-Western, and more in the cultural sense than necessarily the political sense, but obviously both. They had this idea, this notion that if given enough time, the Bolsheviks would eventually drop the internationalism, the militant atheism, which they were very strongly opposed to, and certain aspects of communism, and would basically reorient themselves to the East, and that the White Russians needed to give this initiative time, and instead of fighting against it like some of their other counterparts in the so-called White Russian movement were doing, they needed to work with the authorities to move this forward. Obviously the Bolsheviks used this against them. There's a famous operation where the Bolsheviks invited all of them to come to Russia and then essentially embarrassed them, and then that movement more or less died and it was gone. And it wouldn't be resurrected until the 90s. Alexander Dugin, as I mentioned, although other Russian political figures such as Vladimir Zhirinovsky have also mentioned this. He's the head of the Liberal Democratic Party, which is a right-wing conservative, somewhat conservative party. No, some of their views are conservative. Well, yeah, there's aspects of conservative, but yeah, they've got a little bit of everything. But the point is, this Dugin and Zhirinovsky have time and again mentioned how Russia's future isn't just, with the West, but East and West. Obviously, Asia is much more dynamic now. Europe's struggling, and I'm quite pessimistic on the future of the European Union as far as its current state. And although I'm not, China obviously has its issues going on too, being the most dominant East Asian partner. There's still a lot of obviously room for growth on their part. And anyway, but getting back on topic, there's Dugin's essential idea was that Russia should incorporate politically parts of the former Soviet Union, particularly those that have majority Russian populations. So in this case, Eastern Ukraine and the Crimea have large Russian populations. Also various regions of Kazakhstan that somewhat border the Russian Federation as well. And Belarus as well. The whole ethnic relationship between the two is always emphasized. So here you can see again going back to Pan-Slavism. Some of you may be familiar with Pan-Slavism, especially emphasizing the commonality and the historical and ethnic bonds of the Slavs, East and West, and Southern Slavs. And Eurasianism kind of takes that and expands it to the East as well. And within the modern strain of Eurasianism, there's those that see the Mongol Empire as kind of what laid the foundation of Eurasianism, and the majority see it as the Byzantine Empire that is the foundation for Russia's Eurasian outlook. Interestingly enough, the Russian coat of arms, if you've noticed, some of you have noticed, has an eagle that looks both ways, East and West, and that ties in partially with this attitude that that Russia is both a European and a Eurasian country.
It's actually the Cantacuzene coat of arms from the Byzantine Empire.
Right. Yeah. Well, Moscow's the third Rome, right, Professor? So.
Not for me.
Yeah. So. All right, moving on. Yeah, actually, let me check some real quick. Excuse me. All right, good. So yeah, getting into the pros and cons of both. So we'll start with the association agreement with the EU. This is for Ukraine. So I'll get to Armenia. Armenia already made its decision. It's with the customs union. So this is pros and cons of Ukraine initially signing an association agreement. You can all read and see what I have listed there. I'll touch upon a couple of them. But the pros are they're obviously respect for the rule of law, and what I mean by that is obviously we all kind of it's a value judgment to make. Rule of law is important. We should follow it. And we can all list several reasons why. But in and of itself, it's just following the law. It's good, but it's not enough for it to be the overriding principle. But my criticism of the EU is that this is the one principle they keep emphasizing, And while I mentioned it's a political and a strategic decision on part of Brussels, they keep hammering this rule of law, which is good. They're sticking to their principle, but they're not really being pragmatic about it, and I'll touch upon that in a little bit. FDI, foreign direct investment, that's a huge problem that Ukraine's been facing because their economy isn't that competitive. They're in a recession right now, and they've got, by next summer, they've got to come up with $60 billion, otherwise they're going to default on their sovereign debt. That's the con side of it. I'm kind of skipping ahead. But visa regime, obviously Ukrainians want to study in the EU. You know, some of the best universities are located in Europe. They want to travel there, they want to do business there. Currently, it's still quite difficult for Ukrainians to get a visa to any EU member state. In fact, a few weeks ago or a month ago, there was a bust in a consulate in northwest Ukraine where employees of I forget which EU country it was, but essentially they were charging $1,200. You would pay them $1,200, a Ukrainian would, and they would just issue you a visa. So obviously that's you know, illegal, and the EU found out about it and got all those people out of there. But that's how badly people, especially in Western Ukraine, want to travel to the EU, that they're willing to shell out $1,200 for a visa. And access to the largest common market in the world, you know, 500 plus million customers, that's huge. A good chunk of them obviously have, less so now than a few years ago, have disposable income to throw around, and you know, Ukrainians will gladly take their money. The cons, social engineering, that's a big issue that you don't really hear about too much, but it ties in with what I said earlier. For the European Union, especially when it's having free trade agreements with these smaller countries, you know, I'm not talking about the bigger economies like Mexico or China or Indonesia or these countries that have larger economies and growing economies. It's an economic initiative, but it's a political, it's a strategic initiative. And the European Union has a value system that they more or less adhere to, and they want others in their neighborhood and to adhere to it as well. I'm not so much making a judgment on whether their value system is good or bad. That's, you know, that's up to the individual to study it and decide for themselves what they think of Brussels' value system. But imposing, which I believe is the right word, imposing your one's values upon others, I don't think that that's an appropriate strategy. And we've seen that with so-called nation building in the Middle East. Hasn't worked out so well for us, and I think Europe obviously takes the more soft power approach as opposed to the hard power approach. This ties in with the periphery aspect that I touch upon in the second point. Europe will essentially, or Ukraine will essentially serve a periphery function in the sense of if the Benelux countries and Germany are the core, and the new Europe, the Eastern European countries that joined the EU in the early 2000s are the semi-periphery, then that makes, you know, Ukraine the periphery. Basically, raw materials, in this case, agricultural products, are what Ukraine really has to offer to the EU. They've got some semi-precious metals and some minerals, but nothing of huge strategic value. One of the other countries that I mentioned in the Eastern Partnership Program is Azerbaijan. You could say Azerbaijan has something to offer in the sense that they've got oil and natural gas that the EU is always looking to tap into. Ukraine has some of that, but it's unconventional. So fracking, shale, they're fracking in order to get to the shale gas. That's not something I'm touching upon in this presentation, but in recent, along parallel to discussions with the European Union, there's also been several contracts signed between Chevron and Kiev, ExxonMobil, and some other oil majors to tap into various shale oil and gas sources in the Ukraine. Loss of some sovereign functions. That can be a pro or a con. I just threw it in the con, and it's the same with the next slide, which will touch upon the pros and cons with the customs union. Anytime you join a political or economic union, you're going to have to give up some of your sovereignty. You know, you can't have it all. That's part of the game. So if I could have, if I spent more time, I would have put that in the middle. But that's like I said, both sides. Natural gas, as I mentioned a little earlier, has been a big issue. I'm sure you're all very well aware of 2006 and 2009 when Russia, specifically Gazprom and Ukraine's Naftogaz had a squabble. Russians said Ukraine was not paying its bills on time. Ukrainians said the price was too high, and tap got turned off, and Western Europe had to endure a few weeks of cold winter days. That may very well happen again. This is why the EU has been looking at different options should the taps be closed again. For example, there was a recent agreement with a Slovakian firm to reverse flow west to east gas from Slovakia. Ironically enough, this is Russian gas, and Gazprom has said that this might not be legal and has threatened to take the issue to court should this go ahead. But in the $60 billion bill that's due next summer that I mentioned, the sovereign debt, the EU has offered, along with the IMF, has offered somewhere between $1 to $10 billion, depending on how much reforms Ukraine carries through, passes through its parliament and acts upon. But that's still obviously not enough to meet the $60 billion threshold, and how Ukraine's going to raise the other $50 billion is anyone's guess. So that's definitely a big issue, and it's going to be even more difficult if their largest trading partner, in this case single trading partner, Russia, decides to make trade more difficult for Ukrainian exporters. The last point is what I just touched upon. Not only for Russia, but also the other customs union members might decide to make trade with Ukraine less easy. Pros and cons of the customs union and the upcoming Eurasian Union. There was a meeting between Viktor Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, and Vladimir Putin on November 8th. It was about 3 hours long. Nothing's really been released. It was secret meeting. But some of the things coming out of the rumor mill are that Putin offered immediate foreign direct investment, somewhere up to $15 billion in various infrastructure projects, those being nuclear projects, railroad reconstruction, investments in microprocessor plants for the Russia's space program, so things of that sort. Also, the citizens of post-communist countries, but specifically in this case post-Soviet countries, are well aware of Ukrainian products. Many of them have been carried over from Soviet times into modern times. They might have had a brand name change, but essentially the content has more or less stayed the same. So why this is important is because Armenians, Russians, Azerbaijanis, Kazakhs, they all are familiar with these products. They're more likely to buy them. They've had them. They know it. Whereas, to Europeans, it's, Ukrainian candy, okay, like it's not going to have the same appeal as it does for post-Soviet countries. And that's important to emphasize, because there's I've got a small business background from my undergrad days, but obviously with any product, you've got to spend time and money to get the word out, to advertise, to do marketing, and that can, Ukraine is pressed for time, so that could always be an issue if they were to do that with signing with the association agreement and try to do something like that within the EU, whereas their products are already known in the customs union countries. And if the Eurasian Union goes through in 2015 as it's planned to, then we're going to have, looking at it from a Ukrainian point of view, they're going to have an easier time accessing markets in the Far East and South Asia. India has expressed some interest in having a observer status, some kind of, not full membership, but some kind of ties with the Eurasian Union. Vietnam has expressed interest, and a few other countries. Mongolia has even been thrown into the mix. None of these are major countries in and of themselves. Obviously, China is the big prize, and South Korea that that most countries look to that are developed and also have a huge market. But it's something that I believe the Eurasian Union will facilitate more quickly for Ukrainian exporters than the EU, not only because of geography, but also the value system and the political system are much more diverse between Western Europe, the EU, and East Asian countries, with the exception of Japan and South Korea. The cons are obviously that Brussels, this is important to keep in mind, Moscow said it after Brussels, but Brussels, the EU has specifically stated you cannot be a member of the association, you cannot sign an association agreement and at the same time try to be in the customs union. Moscow at first didn't put that up, then they, after Brussels said that, Moscow started also using this or that type of language, not both. Again, as I mentioned, loss of some sovereign functions. It just goes with the territory. It's pretty obvious to most of us here, like I mentioned, the GDP, there's a huge difference between a 17 trillion per year economy with 500 million people and an economy of 2.3, 2.4 trillion and under 200 million people. So, that's the potential customer. That's a huge difference. And Ukraine has, since independence, but even before independence, there's kind of a, I don't know what the best term would be, but an identity crisis for Ukrainians, especially those living in the Far East and those living in the Far West. Not only the religious differences, those in the West tend to be Christian Catholic, those in the East, right, and those in the East tend to be Christian Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, and they tend to speak Russian instead of Ukrainian, even if they are ethnic Ukrainian. So I really believe that if Ukraine were to go ahead with the customs union, that it would create, or it would increase or widen the fault lines that already exist between these two sub-ethnic groups, you could say, and possibly even, if things really didn't improve in Ukraine, lead to some kind of confederation or eventually a breakup, because the language that I've been reading, that I've been coming across, and also just interacting with in the past with Ukrainians from both parts, they both accept that we're Ukrainian, this or that, but the intra-ethnic tension is very, very high. This is a nice graph I found online. I'm not making myself, but it just gives some examples. Again, pros and cons of going with either direction. Some of you might not be able to read it, so I'll read it for you. On the EU side, it says 40% of Ukrainians in favor. There's been so many polls done that give different figures, but this one's a pretty trustworthy done. This was done by the Kiev Post. They did this poll. So 40% of Ukrainians are in favor of signing an association agreement. 17 billion Ukrainian exports to EU in 2012. So it's a huge number, and that will likely increase with having no tariffs and free trade. No gas discount, as I mentioned earlier, so that's not good. Long lines at the Russian border for Ukrainian products. Loss of 35 billion euros in trade, according to Putin's chief economic advisor, Sergei Glazyev. He's mentioned this a couple of different times. And Ukrainian exporters will save nearly 490 million over 10 years. 15% of goods will have, or 95% of goods will have zero customs duties. So that's very good. That's almost everything. And exports to Russia will shrink by 25%. They already have this last quarter, since August till now, they've already shrunk quite a bit. And enough so that the Prime Minister of Ukraine, Mykola Azarov, has already mentioned that restoring this lost trade is right now the immediate strategic priority of Kiev. Going on the right side, if Ukraine were to go with the Eurasian Customs Union, 35% of Ukrainians are in favor, again, according to the same poll done by the Kiev Post. There's 16 billion that Ukraine exports to Russia. This is in 2012. so not too far off from the 17 mark, to the EU. Again, remember, this is one country, this is 28 countries. So if you really break it down, Russia is a much, much bigger and more important partner based on just this figure alone. 5.5 billion gas discount. So this, as I touched upon earlier, this is what Putin, this is the carrot that Putin essentially hung in front of Yanukovych on their November 8th meeting. Ukraine's paying above market prices for natural gas. It's paying higher prices than Western Europe, and obviously this is very difficult for Ukraine since its economy is not nearly as developed and as wealthy as these Western European countries. The chocolate war likely to end. That was what I touched upon earlier. In August, Russia claimed that there was harmful chemicals in Ukrainian chocolate, specifically the Russian brand. So they banned these chocolates from coming in to Russia, and that was an issue that a lot of pro-EU advocates in and out for Ukraine, in and outside of Ukraine, pointed to and said that here's Russia being vindictive, here's Russia being nasty with us. Why would we want to go with them? So in a sense, it did slightly backfire on the Russians in the image department. And there's the gas wars that ties in again with the 5.5 billion. And one thing that's not on this graph that I touched upon again is the immediate assistance that Putin promised Yanukovych of up to $15 billion into the Ukrainian economy, which would be very helpful for them. So now we go to Armenia. Like I said, I'm only going to talk about Armenia for a little bit because it's already made its decision, and I think we've all had enough time to read about that. But let me just break down the background a little bit. So Armenia, like Ukraine, was also in talks in midsummer. It had finished the drafts, initial agreement, and everything was set basically for the upcoming summit in Vilnius. Next week, actually. So next week, all of this drama for now we'll get some answers to it. What did Ukraine choose? What happened? So on and so forth. What's next? But so everything looked good for Armenia. Armenia for a couple of years had been saying that it was going to go with the EU. That on the security aspect and military and strategic aspect, obviously it was with the Russians. But the economic aspect, it wanted to diversify, and it wanted to broaden its policy of complementarity, which has been, basically Armenia's policy since it's acknowledged to the second, not second, but the second Armenian president and his foreign minister Vilen Khlgatyan. But in reality, de facto, the same policy was pursued under the first president and his administration, Vilen Khlgatyan, although not as overtly as Kocharyan's government would. But anyway, so why did Armenia make an about-face in early September and go with the customs union? The number one issue that has to be brought up, and this is something that Ukraine doesn't have to worry about, and the other Eastern Partnership countries don't have to worry about, is the security aspect. Armenia is in a very hostile geopolitical environment. It has 4 neighbors, 2 of which it has no relations with, 2 block borders. This country to the south is, for all intents and purposes, an international pariah. I'm, of course, referring to Iran. The country to the north, until earlier this past decade, was a failed state. Georgia, they were having regions break apart left and right, and obviously Armenia doesn't have really any serious natural resources to kind of offer to any prospective partners. So Armenia just has the geopolitical location, and you can argue it's the linchpin of the Caucasus. And Russia realized this early on, which is why, basically since the first Yeltsin administration, Russia pursued very close relations with Armenia, and over the years those relations have become more and more institutionalized, and with recent agreements, some as not too long ago as 2010, extending the base that Russia has in Armenia, the military base to the 2040s, has qualitatively raised that cooperation. So anyway, for Armenia, all this tough environment that it found itself in was something to think about not just from a purely military and national security aspect, but also how does our economy tie into it? Because you can't separate. If you have a strong economy, you're more than likely to have a strong military, and the base for a strong national security apparatus. Weak economy, more than likely, it's going to be very difficult for you to maintain a strong national security apparatus. Russia hinted, and it did some actions that showed Armenian policymakers that Russia could play hardball with Armenia if it didn't fall in line is a good way to put it. For example, in midsummer, there was news that came out that about $1 billion worth of Russian arms were being sold to Azerbaijan. I personally, on my analysis of it, didn't take as much issue with it, which I don't want to get too much into it, but the reason being that Russia supplies weapons to a lot of different countries. It supplies weapons to Armenia for free or below market prices, and weapons sometimes even more advanced than what it gave to Azerbaijan. But this was something that obviously was you could say a taste of what Russia could potentially do. Yes, it gave $1 billion worth of weapons. Should Armenia, again, not fall into line, maybe Russia next time will give $3, $4, $5 billion worth, or sell that much to Azerbaijan. And Armenia and Azerbaijan are still technically at war. There's a ceasefire that was signed in '94, but that's not a peace agreement. And every so often you hear of soldiers on both sides being killed by sniper or landmines or what have you. So it's still it's a phrase that you often hear as no war, no peace, or a cold peace, or a mini Cold War. All these phrases are pretty applicable to the situation. Russia's dominant economic position. So in league with Russia's security and national security relations with Armenia since the 90s, Russia has bought several critical infrastructures from the Armenian government, or just Armenian enterprises in general. Those are telecommunications companies. 2 of the 3 cell phone providers are owned by Russian companies, for example. MTS owns one, and Vilen owns the other, and those are, big Russian companies in and of themselves. Gazprom owns the majority shares of the Armenian gas distribution company, and there's talk that they might buy the remaining shares. They own the railway company. They manage the nuclear power plant, which provides 40% of Armenians' domestic energy needs. They provide the uranium as well. They're the largest, if you don't include the EU as a trade bloc, they're the largest source of FDI. The largest Armenian diaspora in the world is located in the Russian Federation. Upwards of 2 million Armenians reside in Russia. So there's a lot of reasons that it made sense for Armenia, when it was really pressed, to make a choice to go with the customs union. Europe offered, like I said, a lot of values that in and of themselves, they sound nice, you got rule of law, this or that, but at the end of the day, it's not gonna, you're gonna go hungry, or you're gonna, have rule of law. You're probably gonna decide to, take care of your stomach first, and then think about the more loftier notions. So that was something that obviously Armenian policymakers had to take into account, because the global worldwide recession, it's hit Armenia hard as well. The restarting the economy has been an important issue of the Sarkisyan administration since 2008, 2009, when it took office. Same issue that I brought up with Ukraine. The competitiveness of Armenian products are questionable in the EU. A well-known Armenian product that would probably do well and does do well, and it's managed by the French. It's one of the few it's one of the few major industries controlled by a European country. Armenian cognac would probably do well in the EU and does do well, but otherwise some of the other products would definitely have a tough time. And the last slide before we open up to Q&A is, as I mentioned, Armenia's policy of complementarity. There's people and Armenian officials that still try to say that this policy exists. For all intents and purposes, I think this policy no longer exists. it's gone, and it served its purpose well. But there's only so long you can, sit on a fence. And there's a well-known saying that I believe is attributed to Margaret Thatcher: if you stand in the middle of the road, you're likely to get run over by both sides. So it had to make the choice, and it sided with the customs union. I keep mentioning the qualitative rise in Russian-Armenian relations. This is evident in a recent statement by Vladimir Putin yesterday that he made, for example, that Armenia's airspace will be integrated into Russia's integrated airspace with Belarus, Russia, and Kazakhstan as well will be integrated. And in the future, Tajikistan and some of these other Central Asian countries who do decide and are going towards joining the customs union and the Eurasian Union. What's next? Armenian officials, high up as well as medium level, have been making more and more frequent trips to East Asia, to Latin America. Armenia traditionally has had good ties with a couple of different countries in South America because of the presence of large Armenian communities there. I'm referring to Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil. But in recent years, relationships with Mexico, Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru, Chile have kind of risen, and I think that's a trend that we're going to see continue. And same thing with East Asia. Armenian officials have been paying more attention to Southeast Asia, ASEAN members, and obviously China. That's on everyone's mind. However, the end of complementarity does not mean that Armenia is now going to have poor relations with Western countries, or that it's not interested in having good relations with Western countries. It just, again, means that it's going to be less and less inclined to kind of sit on the fence and try to extract benefits from both sides. It is more or less going to make the best of the choice that it made in September, which is, if we're with the customs union, if we're with Russia's Eurasian Union project, then we need to get as many concessions from Moscow as possible. So continued low gas prices, because Armenia pays below market prices for natural gas, unlike Ukraine. Continued delivery of armaments from the Russian Federation for free or below market prices. Now Armenia is working on an initiative to prevent any members of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is a grouping of former Soviet countries, and it's kind of like NATO, except obviously not as powerful. But Armenia's argument is that since Armenia has this conflict with Azerbaijan, that countries like Kazakhstan and Russia, which are members of the CSTO, shouldn't be selling any weapons to an enemy state, because an enemy of Armenia then is also an enemy of these other countries. And they've made some headway. There's discussion on possibly inserting legal wording that would prevent future sales of equipment to Azerbaijan. So if that goes through, that will definitely be beneficial, strategically speaking, for Armenia. With that said, I'm finished. Thank you.